right, so we are moving on to lecture 2, and we are going to be talking today a little bit about embryology, and then we are going to move on and talk about epithelial tissue. So I talked yesterday, if you remember, I talked about the levels of organization, and we talked about the hierarchy of life, and that atoms combine to form molecules, right? We talked about that here yesterday, and that these molecules can interact in a certain way to form cells. And then these cells come together to form tissues. That is the hierarchy of life. Tissues will be used to make organs. And what we're going to focus on today in these next couple of lectures are the tissues themselves, okay? And we're going to talk about the fact that there are 4 different types of tissues, and they're listed here. We have over 400, we have over 200 different types of cells in the human body. But they all categorize mostly into 4 different or distinct tissue types. So we can classify most all tissues within these 4 categories. All right, so we're going to start here with epithelial tissue, and we'll spend the last part of the lecture talking about epithelial tissue. You can find this type of tissue. It covers all of our exposed surfaces. It lines internal passageways and chambers, and it produces glandular secretions. So, for example, you can find epithelial tissue in the pancreas, in the thyroid gland, in sweat glands. All right, and we're going to look more closely at epithelial tissue during the second half of the lecture. All right, we'll then move on probably in the next lecture or 2. I can't remember how I have this organized. And we'll start talking more about connective tissue, okay? This is the most diverse of all the tissue types. It has the most diverse function and structures, okay? So connective tissue does fill internal spaces and provide structural support. It's also going to store energy, right? But there's a lot more to connective tissue that we will touch on when we get to that topic. All right, and the third type of tissue is muscle tissue. All right, and within muscle tissue, we have 3 different types of muscle tissue. We have skeletal muscle tissue, like your biceps brachii or your gluteus maximus. We have cardiac muscle tissue, which makes up the heart. And then we have smooth muscle, okay? And we'll talk about that later in the course. And all of these have very similar functions. They generate force, so they can act against another object and cause movement. And so they generate force by contracting. Okay. And then the 4th type of tissue, which you will see much later in the course, we will be talking about neural tissue. And that includes the brain, the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system. All right, and these types of cells, this tissue, can communicate by electrical and chemical stimulation. All right, so I just need you to know a little bit about each of these tissues. We're going to come back and talk about all of them a lot more in depth. But this is just to give you a basic understanding to kind of set the course up. So we have to switch gears a little bit because the question that comes up is, how do we take cells, so individual cells, and combine them to make an organism? How do we get from here to here? How do we get from a single egg and a single sperm and generate an entire human? So we're all derived from a single cell. All of our tissues, all of our organs, all came from a single cell. And so we need to look at some of these early life events to get a better understanding of this. Now, of course, this is not an embryology course, so I really just want to give you the very basics so that you can begin to understand how we get from here to here and how tissues and organs are derived. Okay? So to do this, again, we're going to just do a little bit, the bare minimum, hopefully, of embryology so that you can see where all of our tissues are derived from. All right, here is an image. This is a female uterus right here. This is the uterine tube right here. And you can see a female ovary right here. This is the source of the egg, okay? And the egg contains only half the amount of DNA, right? The other half is in the sperm. So it is referred to as haploid. Hopefully you remember this from your basic biology class. Okay, so where I left off, I apologize. I'm still getting used to this iPad to record lectures. So what I was showing you, or what we were talking about, was you can see the egg being released here. All right, and so when the egg is released from the ovary, this is an event called ovulation. And here, in this uterine tube, right here, fertilization can occur, which would happen at day 0. So the egg and the sperm combine. Well, they don't really combine as much as the sperm donates its DNA. And the egg is now considered to be diploid because it has both the DNA from the mother and the father. Okay, so what happens next is a series of rapid divisions called mitosis. So if you remember back in biology when you learned about mitosis, this is cell division. So every 12 to 24 hours, the cell divides again. Okay, so that's what you're seeing all along here. So the first division, it's also called cleavage. That's another name for cell division. You will get 2 identical cells, okay? And at this stage, this is called a blastomere. So each of these cells will divide, okay? So they will double the number of cells. So you will start out with 2 cells, which you can see here. You will then divide to get the 4-cell stage. It will continue to 8 cells, 16 cells, 32, etc. So they will keep dividing. They will double the number of cells. And between days 3 and 4, you will create a structure called a morula. That is the structure right there called the morula. Okay, it is a solid ball of cells. It continues on its journey into the uterus, and eventually by around day 6, it will implant or embed into the wall of the uterus. So that's what's showing right here. And then between this day 4 and day 6, something remarkable happens. So this solid ball of cells, which you can see here in the morula, this solid ball of cells becomes a hollow ball of cells. And some of these cells secrete a lot of fluid, and you get a fluid-filled cavity called a blastocele. This new structure is called a blastocyst, right here. All right, so up until this stage, all the cells were identical, and they could become anything. They're actually considered something called pluripotent. Or multipotent. So in this blastocyst, cells will then begin to take on different fates. So they're constrained, like their future is now determined to what they will become. So you have what's called an outer layer of cells called the trophoblast right here. Let me highlight this. This outer layer of cells right here is called the trophoblast. This never becomes part of the embryo. It will actually become the placenta. And then you can see that there is a mass of cells right here. This is called the inner cell mass. These cells right there will actually become the embryo. Okay? So the morula ends up going on to become the blastocyst. So the morula goes on to be the blastocyst. And again, now cells have taken on a specific fate. So the blastocyst is going to embed in the uterine wall between days 7 and 10. And then we are going to implant. So when this happens, another remarkable thing begins to occur. So you can see the trophoblast right here. Oh, whoops, let me erase that. All right, you can see the trophoblast. You can see the inner cell mass, okay? And you can see here is the uterine wall. So you can begin to see it implant into the uterine wall. So this ball of cells actually goes in the uterine wall and changes again. So notice what is happening to the inner cell mass here. So you can see the inner cell mass. Let me see if I have a highlighter right here. What's happening in there is that some of the cells are actually separating from each other, and they're going to develop a fluid-filled cavity called the amniotic cavity. And it's okay if you don't know this term. I'm not going to use this term again. I'm just trying to show you this. So these cells are going to form these cells right here are going to form what's called the embryonic disc, okay? And this disc has 2 layers to it. So it looks like if these are cells, you can just appreciate that these are cells. There's 2 layers to those cells there. So they sit on top of each other, the embryonic disc. They sit on top of each other like pancakes. And this embryonic disc is what is going to turn into a human being. All right, so after implantation, so let's talk about what happens after implantation. You get what's called a primitive streak. And this forms the central axis of our body. So this is going to tell you where your head is and where the central part of our body is going to be located. And there are several regions to these cells now. So the cells on top of the layer become the ectoderm. Okay, ecto means above. The second layer is the endoderm. Endo means below. And then there's a layer of cells in between, which is the layer called the mesoderm. Okay, that means the middle. So cells from the ectoderm are actually moving in and populating this new layer called the mesoderm, the middle. So now we have all three of these layers in the developing embryo. So at this point, every organ and every tissue in your body can be traced back to one of these layers, okay? So for example, the ectoderm is going to give rise to all of the neural tissue. It's going to give rise to the brain. It's going to give rise to the spinal cord. And it's also going to give rise to the outer layer of your skin. The endoderm, and I have another slide with all of this written out, is going to give rise to the epithelia, glands, the lining of the GI tract, the gastrointestinal tract. All right, and then the mesoderm is going to give rise to everything else. What I mean is skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, bones, everything else is going to come from the mesoderm. So this is the origin of the developing baby. I meant to take this image out. Let's skip this image and move on to this point. This is another image showing you these layers down here, okay? I've kind of gone over all of these steps so far, and then we focused on what happens when we get these layers, okay? So we talked about the ectoderm becoming neural tissue. We talked about the endoderm, okay, being epithelial and glands. And then we talked about this mesoderm. And again, this is all outlined in a really nice figure right here showing you these layers. Again, here's the ectoderm, here's the mesoderm, here is the endoderm. And so again, what you can see is that what is derived, so we can trace this back, what is derived from the endoderm is lung cells, cells that will make up the thyroid, cells that will make up some of the digestive tract. All right, the endoderm, we have the epidermis of the skin. We talked about neuronal cells, and then some pigment cells will also come from the ectoderm. And then everything else is derived from the mesoderm. So we have cardiac muscle, skeletal muscle, parts of our kidney, red blood cells, and smooth muscle cells. So again, you can trace back where all of everything that is made up in our body, all of these things can be traced back to these very, very early cells, okay?